Hi class, welcome back. It's Dr. Lindner. In this next section, we're going to be looking at body cavities. What I mean by body cavities is you'll see that here within the torso or the trunk in this section, we have different cavities. There's a thoracic cavity here, there's abdominal pelvic cavity, and within them, there's cavities. So within the thoracic cavity, we have a pleural cavity for the lungs, and then we have a pericardial cavity for the heart. And then we have this muscle here called the diaphragm, and that diaphragm is that muscle that will separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And within the abdominal pelvic cavity, we're going to focus on the peritoneal cavity. So we'll focus on pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, and the peritoneal cavity. And within each of these cavities, there's going to be organs in there. So the cavities are going to protect the organs from accidental shocks. And these cavities also permit and give room for the organs to change shape and size. Okay. We'll focus on the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic. Within the thoracic cavity, we have the pleural cavity, and we have the pericardial cavity. And in the abdominal pelvic, we'll focus on the peritoneal cavity. Okay, they all start with P's: pleural, pericardial, and peritoneum. The diaphragm is the muscle here. Now, I'm also going to show you a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. So everything in this picture in the front, everything here is the ventral cavity, and everything back here is the dorsal. So when we have the dorsal cavity, it's the cranial cavity. Well, that's going to be here. That's the cranial cavity. The vertebral canal, spinal cord, and meninges, well, all of that is going to lie within here. Spinal cord, meninges, cerebral spinal fluid, all that's back here. Okay. Everything that's in the front, in the ventral cavity, is going to be the abdominal cavity, the diaphragm, the lungs, and the mediastinum. All that is going to be up in here. Okay. So how do we understand these cavities and be comfortable with names? So the two names that I need you to understand is this term visceral and this term parietal. Because we're going to see visceral and parietal in whether we're talking about the pericardium for the heart, the peritoneum for the intestines and the GI tract, or whether it's the pleural for the lungs. Visceral and parietal layers. So if we take a fist and we push it into a balloon, we have this one layer that makes contact with the fist. The layer that makes contact with the fist, that layer is the visceral layer. The other side of the balloon is this layer here, and that's going to also sit against the body cavity, the wall. That's going to be the parietal layer. So in this case, we have the heart instead of the fist, right? We're looking here, the heart pushing into this cavity, into this balloon, creating a visceral layer. The visceral layer. Let me just change the color here. So we're going to have that layer that makes contact with the organ itself. The organ is called the viscera. The organ is called the viscera. If you've ever known a butcher, the butcher eviscerates the animal. Okay? The other layer is now the outer portion, is the parietal layer. But when we're talking about the heart, we don't say visceral layer and parietal layer. We'll say visceral pericardium or parietal pericardium. Peri means around, cardium is heart. Okay, so the visceral is closer to the viscera, the parietal is closer to the wall. So the parietal layer is closer to the body wall, and the visceral layer is going to cover and make contact with the organ. So now, again, what's in blue was off to the side, and it's a drag and drop. So we have the lungs and we have the heart. When we talk about the heart, it's always pericardium. When we talk about the lungs, it's pleura. Okay. Now let me go back to this for a second. The visceral layer is closer to the organ. The parietal layer is on the outside, closer to the body wall. What you're left with is the in-between layer, which is the pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity contains pericardial fluid. Okay? So now, when we look at the heart, we see this layer closest to the organ. Then we see this layer on the outer side, closer to the body wall. So the outer layer is the parietal pericardium. The one closest to the organ is the visceral pericardium. The layer right between both is the pericardial cavity. That's where you have pericardial fluid. Right? The heart is beating rapidly, it generates heat, so this fluid helps to insulate the heart and to cool it off. Same concept with the lungs. The layer on the inside, that's the visceral layer. The layer on the outside is the parietal pleura, and then the cavity between is the pleural cavity. What's the highlighted structure here? We're looking at the heart, so it's got to be pericardial. It's the innermost, right? The outermost is here in black. So the blue is the visceral pericardium. Now, in the abdominopelvic region, we're going to refer to the layer that covers all of the digestive organs as the peritoneum. There'll be a parietal and a visceral peritoneum. So from the sagittal view, right, we're looking at left and right half. Well, we can see the liver, we can see the stomach, we could see the large intestine, the small intestine. Back here is the pancreas, and back here are the kidneys. Now, the blue structure right here is lining the wall. So that's the parietal peritoneum. If it was going like this inside around the liver, then it would be the visceral peritoneum. And notice the pancreas and the kidneys are behind the peritoneum. They refer to that as retroperitoneum, meaning it's behind it, which is why when there's a pancreatic cancer, it's so uncomfortable and painful because the peritoneum is holding it against the back wall. So when it enlarges, it becomes very, very uncomfortable and painful. There's not a lot of room for expansion of that. Okay. Okay.